Welcome to video 10.1. Today we're going to be talking about solving quadratic equations by factoring. So factoring is what we just did for the entire unit. Now we're just going to take it one step further. So there's only really one new piece, and that's what we do after we've put the equation, after we have factored it, we'll then solve it. So that's the only new step here. The factoring is just like what we did in the last unit. So the first thing is the quadratic equation in standard form. So remember, quadratic equations have a degree of 2, and the standard form we write them is as ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And this is something that we've already talked about in the previous unit. So when solving quadratics, you will be asked to solve for, and it'll be written in one of these three ways, either the roots, zeros, or x-intercepts. And all those things mean the same thing. So how do we solve the quadratic equations? The first step is to get the equation into our standard form, which means that everything is on the one side and the 0 is on the other. And then we'll factor the quadratic equation just like what we did in the previous unit. After the problem has been factored, we will then complete a step called a t-chart, creating a t that separates the two parentheses. Once the parentheses are separated, set each parenthesis to a 0 and solve for the variable, and then you can check each of the roots in the original quadratic equation. Now the reason that we set them equal to 0 is because when we're multiplying, if either of those two factors are 0, the product will become 0, which is what we wanted when we set it equal to 0. So we factor it to figure out, okay, well, what would one of the factors need to be so that then my equation is 0, and then we solve for that factor to become 0. And then the same thing for the other factor. Okay, so let's look at an example together. So this first one is x squared minus 64. So if we look here, first thing we always look for is a GCF, but there isn't one. So then I need to look and decide if I'm going to either use the shortcut or factor like normal. I'm going to do the factor like normal because I know that keeps everything uniform. It's one way of factoring. But if you know the shortcut and you feel you are comfortable enough to use it, you can use it. So what I'm going to do is identify a, b, and c up above. I already have my equation as f of x equals x squared minus 64, but I am going to rewrite it below as 0 equals x squared minus 64 because that's the standard form solving for the roots of the zeros or x-intercepts. Then above that I'm going to write a, b, and c. So I wrote it a, b, and c are. Now I'm going to do the x in the box to go ahead and factor. Okay, so now that I have my x in the box set up, I'm going to put a times c at the top and then b at the bottom. So the top is negative 64, the bottom is 0. So when I think of what are those factors, it's got to be 8 and negative 8. And remember, we've talked about how that has to be the perfect squares. So that's what I'll now break my b term, which I don't have here written. So it's got to be x half of what this one is. Now I have 4 terms, so I'm set up for factor by grouping. So group the first 2, then the second 2. And then I'm going to put the first 2 in the top row and the second 2 in the bottom row. Okay, now that I'm set up, now I just look at the top and I say, okay, what's my GCF up here? I can take out an x, and that goes in that first spot. And then what would you do on top to make that box x squared? That would be another x. And then above the other box would be a positive 8. And then below the x would be a negative 8. And now I have my two factors, the x plus 8 and the x minus 8. Okay, so now I have these written down, but now we need the new step. So this is where we had stopped in the previous packet, but now we need to do that next step, which is to set up our t-chart, which just means to set a t between the two factors and underneath them. And once I have that set up, then I just set each factor equal to 0. So I'll write x plus 8 equals 0 and x minus 8 equals 0. And once I have those written, then I just solve each one for x. So on the left side here, x plus 8 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 8 to both sides. And then I get x equals negative 8 on that side. And then on the right side, I'm going to add 8 to both sides. And when I do that, I get x equals 8. So those are my two answers, x equals negative 8 and x equals 8. You can either just box them in the way that they're written, or you can off to the side write them as a set of numbers, negative 8 and 8. Okay, and that's it for this. So the only new step for this video is just going on past the factoring to then write our t-chart and solve for the values of x. Okay, I'll see you again tomorrow. Have a good night.